Layla Sloan had never planned to rent property in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood lined with ornamental trees and manicured hedges. Her world was rooted in outdoor installations, environmental design, and wild asymmetry. Her clients were usually museums or architectural collectives, not people who obsessed over grass height. But a unique opportunity had opened through a conservation foundation. A now-abandoned public garden located behind a private residential block, once intended as a demonstration site for local plant species and sculpture integration. The place had been forgotten after the pandemic, its trust dissolved into another administrative reshuffle. Through a limited-use agreement, the foundation leased the property to Layla for 1 year, with the intention that she would breathe life back into it. In exchange, she could use it as the base for her next large-scale exhibit and bring in private guests for viewings. It was ideal, isolated, quiet, creative. That was until Karen Miller decided it wasn't. The first few days were uneventful. Layla moved in slowly, piece by piece. Tools, samples, irrigation materials, and a few sculptures she'd had stored in a Brooklyn studio. The property was framed by an old stone wall and an iron fence overgrown with jasmine and ivy. She was surprised by the condition of the space. The soil was dry, many of the pathways had collapsed, and some of the support beams near the perimeter leaned at precarious angles. But the bones were solid, and unlike other jobs, this was hers. Her name on the lease, her name on the installation, her signature on every decision. She wasn't just decorating someone else's concept, she was building her own. Karen made her entrance on the 4th morning. Layla had been spreading mulch near the northwest corner when she heard deliberate footsteps on gravel, the kind made by someone who wants to be heard. A large woman, broad-shouldered, perhaps in her early 60s, wearing a lavender windbreaker 2 sizes too tight and oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, stood just beyond the garden fence, tapping one hand rhythmically against the rod. Iron. "Excuse me," she said, drawing the word out like it was part of a performance. "Are you with the company that bought this land?" Layla stood up slowly, brushing soil from her gloves. "It's leased through the city. I'm here on a conservation project." Karen stepped forward, leaning slightly against the fence post. "That's funny," she said, not smiling, "because for decades this used to be open access. My husband and I, he passed 3 years ago, we used to walk through here every Sunday. There was an agreement with the original board. That gate," she pointed to an old iron arch that had been welded shut, "was always unlocked until people like you came around and ruined everything with your modern crap and rules." Layla looked at her for a long second. "This section was closed for safety violations 10 years ago. I've seen the inspection reports." Karen laughed, sharp and derisive. "Safety violations. Sure. I suppose the fence is just decorative then. Or is that new? Those horrible spikes along the base, those aren't legal, you know. You can't just go stabbing the ground like you're setting a trap for raccoons." Layla didn't answer. She'd added the spikes herself, angled iron rods discreetly placed at the lower third of the perimeter, not to injure, but to discourage dogs and trespassers from crawling underneath. They were welded in place, painted to match the original finish. Clean, unobtrusive, and, most importantly, within regulation. Karen didn't know that, but she just declared herself as someone who didn't need facts to feel entitled. That was information worth filing away. The conversation ended without a resolution. Karen eventually turned and walked away, muttering something about city people and disrespecting community legacy. Layla returned to her work, but not to the same rhythm. Something about the woman's tone had a way of latching into her bones. Over the next week, Karen reappeared several times, never inside the garden, but always hovering at its edge. Sometimes she walked a dog. Other times she just stood there, pretending to examine flowers growing on the other side of the fence. Each time, she seemed to watch a little longer, stay a little closer, say a little less. Then came the leaflets. Someone, Layla never saw who, left a batch of hand-printed flyers under her gate with slogans like, "Save our neighborhood," and "Say no to private gardens." No names were listed, no group affiliations, just vague rhetoric and the occasional reference to outsiders disrespecting legacy spaces. She'd expected some friction. Artists and gardens always upset someone. But this wasn't friction. This was targeted. The situation escalated when deliveries started arriving with errors. A shipment of sandstone slabs she had ordered 2 weeks earlier was rerouted, delivered instead to a cul-de-sac 2 blocks away. A miscommunication, the driver said. Then, a pallet of irrigation pipes was returned to the distributor without her request. Layla began documenting everything: dates, invoices, timestamps, photographs. She didn't need this to become a drama. She wasn't looking for conflict. But experience had taught her that when pressure builds from multiple sides, it's better to be over-prepared than surprised. The final sign came not with a bang, but with a voice, loud, panting, and furious, shouting from the fence line early one afternoon. Layla had been adjusting a support structure when Karen reached over the rail, one hand grasping at a low-hanging vine. "This thing is invading my yard," she snapped. "I told you already. Keep your junk on your side." Layla walked toward her slowly, cautiously. "That vine is attached to a support column. It's not yours to cut." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I don't care. I have rights here. My husband had access. Everyone knows that fence was always symbolic. You're not going to shut me out with your spikes and your warnings. You don't get to build a fortress here like you're special." Then, in one jarring motion, Karen reached forward and grabbed Layla by the shirt, twisting the fabric near her shoulder, hard. It happened so fast, Layla didn't think. She reacted. Instinct took over. She seized Karen's wrist with her left hand, twisted it outward and jerked it down. Karen's bulk shifted forward, and with a startled grunt she stumbled, losing her grip and her balance. Her forearm hit the top of the spike rail, not enough to impale, but enough to leave a deep scratch and knock the wind out of her. With a gasp, she fell, legs tangled in the base of the fence, wedged awkwardly between 2 metal posts. Layla stepped back. Her breath came fast, but her expression remained still. Karen groaned, struggling to untangle herself, legs flailing as she tried to push her weight up from the metal. "Don't you dare just stand there," she barked. "Help me." Layla crossed her arms. "You reached over and grabbed me. You fell because of your own aggression. If you can reach into someone's space, you can climb out of it." Karen didn't respond immediately. She winced, then cursed, then pulled herself upright using the post. Her sleeve was torn and a small smear of blood ran along her wrist. Without another word, she turned and limped off, not even glancing back. Layla didn't feel victorious. There was no satisfaction. There was only a quiet, visceral certainty that something had shifted. This wasn't over, not because of what happened, but because Karen had walked away without escalating. Because she had chosen silence. And people like her didn't stop because of boundaries. They only paused to plan. The following morning brought no direct retaliation, no knocks at the gate, no officials or patrol cars, no screaming from the neighbor's porch. There was, instead, a quiet so complete it unsettled Layla more than if Karen had shown up with a baseball bat and a lawsuit. She didn't sleep well the night before. The weight of the encounter, Karen's hand gripping her shirt, the sound of flesh scraping metal, the sudden visceral silence, kept looping in her mind like a cracked reel. Layla wasn't afraid in the traditional sense. She wasn't looking out her window expecting Karen to come barreling through. But there was something too calm in the aftermath, something that didn't sit right in her gut. She began her morning routine as if nothing had changed, checked the moisture levels in the soil, opened the greenhouse vents, and began organizing the delivery list for next week. But the tension lingered. Every time a bird shifted in the trees or a car idled too long near the curb, her muscles coiled slightly, a warning system trying to stay ahead of whatever came next. By noon, she forced herself into focus by turning on the irrigation line and reviewing the sketch model she'd created for the eastern path, where a set of stone arches was scheduled to be reconstructed. The line sparked a little as it activated, delayed pressure build, but the system kicked in, drizzling evenly across the beds. She moved on. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the first sign of retaliation revealed itself, not through action, but omission. Her municipal maintenance alert, an online dashboard that tracked pending complaints or service orders related to her leased land, had been modified. 3 new entries had appeared, all marked pending investigation: hazardous perimeter structures, noise violations, and unregistered excavation activity. Layla stared at the entries, blinking. She hadn't submitted anything. No notice had come. The hazardous perimeter one made sense. Karen's complaint, likely about the spikes. But noise? She hadn't used a single power tool louder than a standard drill in weeks. Excavation? She'd cleared brush and removed dead trees, nothing near foundation depth. And, more importantly, none of it had warranted attention before. She logged off and walked the perimeter slowly, observing the fence line. Nothing had been touched, but someone, somewhere, had filed a complaint detailed enough to trigger a city-level intake. That meant it hadn't come from a casual call. It came from someone who knew the language, the procedure, and exactly how to trigger an official response without even needing to step onto the property. Karen. Layla didn't panic. She took photos of every structure, every installation, the ground conditions, tool storage areas, standard documentation protocol. Then she sent an email to the Foundation's legal liaison, summarizing the events, attaching the photos, and including a calm, factual recounting of what had occurred the previous day with her neighbor. She didn't embellish. She didn't speculate. She stuck to what could be proven. Within the hour, she received a reply. They were initiating a formal inquiry and would contact her again after reviewing her site lease to cross-reference the existing boundaries and permissions. No alarm, no urgency. Just standard bureaucratic pace. Layla knew how that worked, but the ball was rolling now, and not just on her side. The next incident came the day after. One of her suppliers, an independent stoneworker from Portland, called to confirm cancellation of a large custom order. Layla hadn't canceled anything. He explained that someone had called using her project number, claimed to be an assistant, and requested the order be put on hold indefinitely. She clarified the error, reinstated the order, and asked him to log the call details. The name the caller used? Karen Sloan. Karen had pretended to be her sister. It was clumsy, lazy sabotage, but it had worked. The delay would cost her 5 days at least, maybe more. Layla didn't waste energy on confrontation. Instead, she made a single call to the project coordinator at the city's Department of Environmental Partnerships. She explained the impersonation, not as a direct accusation, but as a breach of the vendor process tied to their lease agreement. The woman on the other end was professional, quiet, but clearly displeased. "Send me the invoice chain," she said. "If someone's interfering with approved funding, that's going to open a very different category of problems." Then came the truly disturbing moment, and it had nothing to do with city services or garden tools. Late that night, long after she'd powered down the work site and returned to the small guest cottage she used for rest, she stepped outside for air and heard a soft, metallic click near the front gate. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a sharp mechanical sound that didn't belong, like a latch being tested or metal scraping against stone. Layla stayed still in the shadow of the doorway, barefoot on the brick. Her eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, and she focused on the fence. Nothing moved. The air was still. No footsteps, no flashlight beam. But the sound had been real. She didn't go charging outside with a camera or call the police in a panic. Instead, she waited. 5 minutes, then 10. Then she walked the fence the next morning. No broken latches, no scratches. But something small had been wedged under the ivy near the northwest edge of the fence. A pair of work gloves, caked with dirt. Not hers. Not one of her crew's. Too small for most male workers, too wide for her own hands. Karen's. Later that day, a city inspector arrived, unannounced but polite. He had been assigned to follow up on the hazardous perimeter claim. Layla met him with a folder of printed documentation and a ready explanation. She didn't argue or grandstand. She showed him the installation, explained the materials, referenced the clause in her contract that permitted barrier reinforcement along unfenced edges. The inspector nodded, took photos, and left. It lasted 23 minutes. No citations issued. But an hour after he left, Layla noticed something bizarre. Several of her field markers, the ones placed to designate irrigation points and drainage channels, had been removed. Not stolen. Relocated. Some stood in random places near the edges of the property. Others had been pulled out and dropped on their sides like someone had wandered the space randomly tugging things from the ground. She hadn't left the gate unlocked. And there were no signs of a break-in. The pieces clicked faster than she expected. Karen wasn't trying to win anything. She wasn't trying to sue or punish. She was trying to exhaust. To drive Layla to a point where she'd question whether finishing the project was worth the mounting stress, errors, repairs, and invisible sabotage. It was an old tactic. Pressure through attrition. You don't need to knock someone down if you can convince them to kneel voluntarily. Layla sat at her work table that night and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The incident log she kept for site disruptions. She updated it in full. Dates. Names, conversations, orders, the glove. She didn't care if it ever went to court. It wasn't about building a case. It was about clarity, about knowing what was being done and refusing to accept it as coincidence. The next morning, she installed a discrete motion-activated alert system, not with loud alarms or video streams, but with small vibration sensors on the fence's interior posts. If the boundary was disturbed again, she'd know exactly when and where. She didn't intend to stop working. She didn't intend to escalate, but she would not pretend this wasn't happening. Karen had made the first move. Layla had simply returned serve, and something told her the game was just getting started. By the end of the week, Layla was operating in a kind of heightened neutrality, calm in her movements, deliberate in her planning, but constantly aware that she was under observation, not by some official agency, not even openly, but through the daily interference that spoke of an adversary both patient and personally invested. The work continued. She installed a new gravel path near the central sculpture area, reinforced the base of the south-facing arches, and prepared for the arrival of an electrical technician who would begin wiring the low-voltage garden lighting that would give the place dimension in the twilight hours. The project was still on schedule, albeit tighter now. She didn't want Karen to win by attrition, but staying on schedule had become less about creative flow and more about strategy. Every task had to be done faster, smarter, without leaving anything vulnerable. That wasn't what artistry was supposed to feel like, but in her gut, she knew this wasn't about design anymore. This was defense. The first obvious breach happened on a Monday morning, early enough that the sun hadn't yet burned off the dew. Layla walked the perimeter, as always, and immediately noticed that the northwest corner, just behind the irrigation regulator box, had been disturbed. A shallow trench she'd dug the previous day had collapsed inward. Its contents spilled across the stone edging. At first, she thought it had been animals, Raccoons or stray dogs sometimes pushed through undergrowth in the night, but when she crouched down, she saw that the regulator valve had been turned. Not just bumped, deliberately closed. That valve didn't rotate on its own. You had to grip it hard and crank it counterclockwise 3 full turns to shut it off. Someone had done that. The surrounding footprints were shallow, but fresh. Too small for most of the crew. The gloves again. By mid-afternoon, 2 contractors had canceled their scheduled appointments, citing confusion with access codes. Layla verified that no changes had been made to the digital key log. She texted both teams to confirm details and learned that each had received a separate message from what appeared to be a second contact listed under her name, with alternate gate instructions. She hadn't created those entries. But someone had. Someone with enough knowledge to mimic her tone and create false access credentials. Layla deleted the ghost entries and locked down the security profile on her scheduling platform. She didn't call the police. There was nothing to report yet that would warrant a response. There was no proof Karen was behind it, but she suspected Karen had help now. Someone younger, someone tech-savvy, maybe a relative or someone with just enough understanding of her system to push at the edges. The strain began to affect the crew. Her assistant, Ren, a young man who had worked with her in 2 previous installations, began showing signs of agitation. He didn't say much at first, but on the 3rd day of disrupted workflow, he finally muttered, "You sure someone doesn't have a key?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew he was right to ask and there wasn't a good answer to give. She hadn't lost her key. No one else had access to the storage shed, but clearly someone was getting in, or getting information in ways she hadn't accounted for. Things escalated again that Friday. At exactly 3:17 p.m., as Layla was inspecting the newly arrived sandstone for the seating area, a municipal vehicle pulled up outside the front gate. A uniformed city compliance officer stepped out, mid-50s, heavy-set, with the weary posture of someone used to seeing the worst of neighborhood bureaucracy. He held a clipboard in one hand, a digital scanner in the other. Without ceremony, he informed her that he was responding to a formal complaint regarding unlicensed construction and suspected code violations pertaining to lighting infrastructure and restricted utility pathways. Layla remained composed. She didn't argue. Instead, she invited him to walk the site, showed him the permit numbers, referenced the lease agreement, and pointed out where foundation lines stopped well before any restricted easements. The man wasn't hostile. If anything, he seemed vaguely apologetic, making notes as she guided him through each structure, occasionally muttering things like, "These complaints always come in waves," or, "You'd be amazed what people think counts as illegal construction." But, just as they reached the eastern edge, he paused. A wire, previously marked with a red tag, had been severed. Not torn. Cut clean. Layla hadn't noticed it earlier. The man raised an eyebrow. "You're aware this could trigger a citation?" She stared at the wire. It had been buried under a protective conduit the day before. Someone had come into the site and used a tool to remove the cover and slice the cable. He didn't accuse her directly, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Layla responded with calm certainty. "I'll provide full access records, camera logs, and contractor reports for the past 72 hours. That cable wasn't cut under my supervision, and no authorized work was scheduled in that section." He made a note, promised to forward his findings, left without further comment. But the damage had been done. Someone had created the appearance of negligence, sabotaged infrastructure just enough to invite scrutiny without making it obvious. It was the perfect blend of petty and strategic, and it forced Layla to divert 2 full days to rewiring, inspecting, documenting, and reinforcing her site's security again. That night, Karen walked her dog slowly along the outer sidewalk, pausing long enough to let the animal sniff through the fence. She didn't speak. She didn't make eye contact, but her posture radiated satisfaction, like someone standing over a chessboard watching the other player's pieces scatter. Layla didn't move to engage. She simply stood on the upper step of the patio, arms crossed, eyes unwavering. Karen left without comment, but the message was clear. I know, and I'm not done. The following Monday brought an entirely different kind of pressure. A certified letter arrived at the gate, delivered by private courier. Inside was a formal notice. Not from the city, not from any local authority, but from a neighborhood association. It cited her for visual disruptions, unsanctioned modifications to historical green space, and unauthorized materials inconsistent with community design standards. The phrasing was bizarre, almost archaic. The group claimed oversight through an outdated bylaw tied to a defunct district council. Layla knew this had no legal merit. Her lease was through a conservation trust that superseded all residential jurisdiction. But the existence of the letter, the specificity of the language, the effort to make it appear official, it was another front in Karen's quiet war. That same day, Layla's motion sensor triggered 3 alerts within a 40-minute span, all localized at the rear gate, which had been locked since the installation began. When she checked the feed, there was no one visible, nothing but the slow sway of trees and the glint of late sun on the garden wall. But the log showed movement. Not wind, movement, precise, repeated, and undetected by the camera's angle. She walked the perimeter herself after sunset, flashlight in hand. There were no signs of tampering, but near the back fence, hidden in the ivy, she found a fresh cigarette butt, still faintly warm to the touch. Karen didn't smoke. Layla had never seen her with one. This was someone else. Another hand in the dark. The realization dawned slowly but fully. Karen was no longer working alone. She had begun enlisting others. Whether family, neighbors, or hired help, it didn't matter. The point was no longer just territorial assertion. It was conquest. Erasure through pressure, through 1,000 cuts, through creating so many points of failure that Layla would eventually fold, give up the lease, walk away. But Layla had no intention of folding. That night she made a phone call, not to the police, not to any private investigator or security firm, but to the legal affairs officer attached to her foundation. She recounted every incident, provided timestamps, data logs, photos, letters, and a growing file of internal documentation. The officer listened in silence, then asked her one question. Have any of these actions caused you to alter your project? Layla hesitated. Then she answered honestly. Yes, I've diverted work. I've spent hours repairing and documenting instead of creating. I've stopped trusting my timeline. That's what they want. Then we'll proceed, the voice on the other end said, steady and measured. Let's not wait for them to escalate further. We'll begin with a site boundary audit and initiate a civil advisement process. Quietly. Just let us handle it now. Layla hung up, exhaled, and felt something shift. Not relief, not even victory, but balance. She wasn't alone in the game anymore. The board had changed. The stakes had not. But now the pressure would press both ways. The days that followed were unusually quiet, almost sterile in their stillness. For the first time in weeks there were no unexpected alerts, no city workers arriving unannounced, no vandalized installations or tampered deliveries. It was the kind of silence that did not invite relief but rather whispered caution. Layla didn't believe the storm had passed. She believed it had shifted. And when things grow quiet after so much deliberate disruption, it's often because someone is waiting to see how their last move landed, or they're preparing for the next one. The legal officer from the Conservation Foundation followed through on his promise. Within 4 days, a private team of boundary and code compliance auditors arrived. Not city workers, but independent contractors licensed through a preservation oversight board. They carried clipboards, cameras, and folders of permits and began walking the perimeter in pairs, cross-referencing every inch of Layla's site against her lease and jurisdictional overlays. They weren't interested in Karen or her history. They weren't interested in local gossip or whispered threats about neighborhood tradition. Their interest was cold, methodical, and factual. Where did the land begin, and where did it end? What was permitted? What had already been done? Were there violations, even accidental ones? And were any complaints submitted by third parties factually valid? Layla welcomed them, not performatively. She didn't hover, didn't interject, or attempt to guide their impressions. She provided access to her documents, her records, her logs, and then stepped back. It was the most peace she'd felt in weeks, watching professionals do what they were trained to do, assess truth without personal stakes, without agendas or grudges. But Karen didn't welcome them. Late in the afternoon on the second day of the audit, Layla observed her neighbor standing near the rear gate again, hands on her hips, talking animatedly to one of the auditors through the bars. Layla couldn't hear the exchange clearly, but she saw the auditor eventually turn away and walk back inside the perimeter without taking notes. Karen didn't follow. She remained outside the gate for several minutes, staring through the bars like she was trying to decode the future. That evening, Layla found something tucked under the windshield wiper of her parked truck. It wasn't a letter or a flyer. It was a photograph. Grainy, low resolution, clearly printed from a phone. An image of her standing alone in the garden, arms lifted mid-gesture as if giving directions. Behind her, blurred but unmistakable, were 2 young interns from her crew, bending over a stone layout, laughing about something unseen. The angle was wrong for a casual observer. It had been taken from height, probably from the second floor of a house across the street, maybe even through a zoom lens. There was no note attached, no accusation. Just the photo, left like a trap, like a promise. The message was clear even without words. You're being watched, and your boundaries are not real. Layla didn't flinch. She photographed the image, logged it, and placed the print in an envelope marked with that day's date. But what stuck with her wasn't the image itself. It was the realization that Karen had escalated from sabotage to surveillance. She was no longer just interfering. She was trying to create a record of her own. A narrative. A version of events where Layla was the interloper, the intruder, the chaotic force disrupting an imagined peace. And by collecting images without context, Karen was trying to build her own story, one made of carefully framed evidence, not of truth. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. 2 nights later, well past midnight, Layla was reviewing plans for the final irrigation phase when she heard a soft knock. Not at the door, but on the side of the house. Not pounding, not urgent, just 2 firm taps against the siding, enough to trigger instinct. She didn't move at first, her hand frozen on the mouse. The lights inside were off. She waited. Another knock, then silence. When she finally stepped outside with a flashlight, she found nothing. No footprints, no figures. But near the garden shed, hanging from the doorknob, was an old ceramic wind chime, shaped like ivy leaves, delicate, handmade. She recognized it immediately. It had been part of the original demonstration garden, decades ago, long before she arrived. She had removed it herself during one of her first site clearings, packed it carefully, and stored it inside the locked shed. And now, here it was, hung outside like an ornament, gently swaying in the breeze. The implication wasn't loss, it was access. Someone had entered the shed without keys, opened a sealed box, and placed the item outside. Not to steal, not to damage, but to prove they could. Layla stood motionless in the dark for several minutes, staring at the ceramic leaves as they clinked softly. That was the moment the game stopped being theoretical. Karen, or someone acting for her, had moved from interference into intimidation. Psychological warfare, not through destruction, but through intrusion. There had been no break-in reportable to the police, no security footage, no evidence of damage. But it was an intrusion all the same. The next morning, Layla sent the audit team an addendum, a request to include the shed's security access in their review. She didn't need them to find anything. She just needed to document that the incident had occurred, that someone had crossed into a protected space without authorization. She began using a secondary lock on the shed and relocated certain tools to a more secure location inside her trailer, not because she expected them to be taken, but because the point had shifted now. It wasn't about stopping theft. It was about preventing violation. The audit concluded 2 days later. The report was clean. All structures were compliant. All work matched approved plans. Every complaint Karen had filed, whether through city channels or third-party pretenses, had been dismissed. The findings were sent to both the foundation and to Layla directly, along with a formal letter affirming her continued authorization to maintain, modify, and exhibit within the boundaries of the lease without external review. But that wasn't the end of it. On the evening following the report's release, Karen stood again at the edge of the garden wall. This time, she didn't bring her dog. She didn't pace or mutter. She just stood there, perfectly still, one hand resting on the fence post, eyes fixed on the far end of the stone path. She stayed for nearly 20 minutes before leaving without a word. Layla never approached. She didn't wave or speak. She simply watched through the trees, her posture unchanged, her resolve silent but solid. Something in Karen's stillness that night felt final, not like surrender, but like recalibration, a signal that the next move, whenever it came, would not be reactionary. It would be planned. She had seen the audit fail. She had seen the process ignore her accusations. Now she would move differently, and Layla, in turn, would be ready. Because now there was no illusion left between them, no neighborly excuse, no misunderstanding of property lines or misread intentions. This was no longer about a garden. It was about control, and both of them knew it. The peace that followed the audit was a false one, tight, temporary, and clearly strategic. For nearly a week, nothing unusual happened. No deliveries were rerouted. No infrastructure tampered with, and even the motion sensors remained quiet, recording only the usual wildlife and the occasional gust of wind strong enough to stir the underbrush. Layla allowed herself to exhale slightly, not out of relief, but simply to release the building tension that had left her chest wound like a coil for far too long. The work resumed at full pace. The final installation zone was taking form, a sloping gravel pathway flanked by native wild grasses and embedded with low-profile lighting, leading to a reflective basin she designed as the anchor for the garden's eastward line of sight. It was clean, symmetrical in its asymmetry, and for the first time in months, Layla found herself working not from defense but from intention again. But it didn't last. The next move came on a Monday, shortly after sunrise. A flatbed truck arrived at the front gate, loaded with rolls of synthetic turf and prefabricated plastic fencing panels. The driver was confused. He had a delivery order with Layla's name on it, the garden's address, and a receipt already marked "paid in full." She hadn't ordered anything of the sort, had never even used synthetic turf in a project, and certainly hadn't approved any off-site purchases with her payment credentials. The materials bore no direct vendor branding, and the receipt showed only an online procurement service as the source. Someone had gone through considerable effort to make the shipment appear legitimate. When Layla asked the driver who had signed off on the order, He shrugged and handed her a name written in lazy penmanship across the bottom corner of the form. L. Sloan. The name alone was no surprise, but the forgery, the coordination, and the fact that it had been prepaid to appear as though she were modifying the site with non-compliant materials. That was escalation. Someone wanted it on record that she was preparing to replace her natural installation with something manufactured and against the Foundation's ecological guidelines. She documented everything, took photos of the delivery, cross-referenced the receipt numbers with her financial accounts, which thankfully showed no actual charge, and called the liaison at the conservation office immediately. The legal team initiated a report of identity misuse, but the fallout didn't stop there. 2 days later, a man arrived at the gate claiming to be an environmental quality inspector, holding a laminated badge and a printed checklist. He stated plainly that he was conducting a spot inspection based on community concerns about groundwater contamination. When Layla asked for credentials, he became vague, referencing state environmental policy and citing a cluster of regulation codes that didn't apply to leased properties under restoration management. Layla requested his name and office. He refused to give either and abruptly turned to leave. She took photos of his vehicle as he drove off, then forwarded the information to her legal liaison. A follow-up confirmed that no such inspector had been dispatched by any known agency. It had been a bluff, an actor, likely hired to appear authoritative, to unsettle, to suggest that authorities were watching and ready to intervene. The performance was sloppy, but the message was clear. Karen was done playing quietly. She was now deploying false authority to amplify pressure. That same afternoon, Wren, her assistant, walked off the job. It wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no confrontation. He simply approached Layla as she was preparing the next phase map and told her that he couldn't continue. When she asked why, he hesitated, then answered without bitterness, "I don't know who you pissed off, but this place isn't normal. Every time I come here, something's moved, someone's watching, deliveries are screwed up, and now we're getting fake visits from random guys with clipboards. I just want to work. I didn't sign up to be in someone's silent feud." She didn't argue. She nodded. She understood. He left that evening, and she didn't replace him. The days that followed were strangely hollow. Not because the work stopped, if anything she worked longer hours than before, but because the energy had shifted entirely. The project no longer felt like a space being built for beauty or contemplation. It felt like a fort under siege. She stopped bringing her sketchbooks into the field. She stopped taking long walks around the perimeter. Everything she did now was with purpose. Maintain, reinforce, document, preserve. Karen had hollowed the joy out of it, not by winning, but by poisoning the air around the work itself. Then came the night of the red lights. It started as a low hum, barely audible. Layla had just locked the garden shed and was preparing to head back into the guest cottage when she noticed a faint glow through the trees at the far end of the lot. Red, low, pulsing like a heartbeat. As she walked toward it, she realized it wasn't a reflection. It was deliberate. Someone had placed small battery-powered lights, maybe 8 or 10 of them, along the fence line, embedded among the undergrowth. They blinked slowly, in unison, casting the entire back quadrant of the site in a rhythmic crimson hue. There were no wires, no timers, just lights, synchronized manually, placed with care. Layla didn't remove them immediately. She stood for a long time, watching them, arms crossed. There was no signature, no note, but there didn't need to be. The symbolism was unmistakable. Perimeter marked, danger implied, eyes watching. It wasn't just intimidation. It was ritualistic, measured, intended to unsettle not through noise or damage but through the cold repetition of a pattern, like a warning left by someone convinced they were righteous. She documented them and left them where they were for the night. By morning, they were gone. The legal liaison from the foundation reached out the next day. The quiet tone of his voice was different. He'd spoken with Layla several times before, always formally but cordially. This time he was measured but concerned. "We're going to escalate," he said. "Not publicly, not through police reports. We're initiating a litigation track. Civil interference, targeted harassment, misrepresentation, property boundary encroachment. The pattern's enough. It'll take time, and we may never get a court date, but we're done waiting for them to overplay. We're drawing the line now." Layla thanked him. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was something colder, quieter, a kind of focus that sharpened rather than burned. She didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know how the foundation would proceed. She trusted them to do their part, just as she'd done hers. For months, she'd been baited, harassed, lied about, and manipulated. But she had never left the line, never struck back. And now that silence would speak for her. But Karen wasn't finished yet. That weekend, Layla received a request from a local architectural committee. They wanted to conduct a site visit as part of a design showcase for upcoming public exhibitions. Someone had submitted her project anonymously for consideration. At first, she was confused. No part of her installation was ready for public view. But the committee explained that her garden had been highlighted as an example of controversial urban recovery efforts, submitted along with a dossier of site photos and a proposal summary, none of which she had authored. She requested a copy. The language was unmistakably hers in structure, but not in tone. Someone had mimicked her writing, woven phrases from her past applications into a false narrative that painted her work as radical, unsanctioned, and intentionally divisive. She didn't stop the visit. She let them come. And when they did, she gave them the truth, the real history, the interference, the boundary disputes, the stolen images. She didn't offer drama. She offered clarity. They left impressed not by her suffering, but by her discipline. Karen didn't show herself that day. But the same evening, after the guests were gone, Layla found one final token hanging from her front gate, a single white ribbon, tied in a neat bow, with a small brass bell threaded through its loop. It chimed softly in the breeze, calm and delicate. But Layla recognized the bell. It had hung in the corner of the old shed since the site's original dedication. She hadn't seen it in months. She hadn't moved it. Someone else had. Karen's message was simple. "I still have the keys." Or, "I still know how to get through." But the difference now was that Layla didn't care what Karen had. What mattered now was what Layla had built, and what she refused to let anyone unmake. It wasn't until the night of the storm that everything finally broke. For days, the clouds had been gathering with a kind of mute insistence, slow-moving and fat with static, hovering above the ridgeline like a held breath. The forecast called for scattered showers, but anyone who had lived through a real storm knew this wasn't going to be scattered. It would arrive fast, uninvited, and it would make a point. Layla had no way of knowing that the same could be said about what was already on its way. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone flat and gunmetal gray. Wind moved through the trees with forceful rhythm, pushing leaves into tight spirals and bending the slender grasses she'd spent the morning trimming along the basin. She didn't stop working. Rain didn't bother her. It was honest, predictable, and far less invasive than the quiet games Karen had been playing for months. Still, something in her stomach was off. Not fear, exactly, but a pulse of inevitability, like a door that was about to swing open after months of barely creaking on its hinges. The storm arrived around dusk, thunder rolling over the hills in slow intervals, lightning dragging white scars across the horizon. She'd secured the equipment, braced the storage door, shut the greenhouse vents, and was in the cottage preparing tea when the motion sensor buzzed. She didn't rush to check. False triggers had become common. Squirrels, gusts, sometimes even shadows moving just the right way. But when it buzzed again, once, then again, immediately after, she crossed to the console and scanned the readout. Zone 5. North fence. Multiple signatures. Weight class sensors indicated 3, maybe 4 figures. The screens were black. Lightning illuminated nothing but trees. Rain masked sound. But she didn't hesitate. She pulled on her boots, wrapped her jacket around her shoulders, and took the flashlight. She didn't bring a weapon. She didn't need one. The moment had already arrived. It wasn't coming anymore. It was here. She followed the stone path quickly, keeping low, her boots slipping slightly on wet gravel. The wind whipped past her ears and tried to carry away the sound of movement ahead. Faint, but deliberate. By the time she reached the edge of the garden, near the archways where the trail curved closest to the north fence, she saw them. 3 figures, all in black rain gear, one holding a bolt cutter, another pulling at the fence with gloved hands. The third stood slightly back holding a small case, something sleek, modern, not the kind of tool someone brings unless they know exactly what they're doing. They didn't see her at first. She crouched behind a hedge and waited, breathing in rhythm with the wind. When the one with the bolt cutter moved forward, aligning the blades with the lock on the perimeter gate, Layla stepped out from behind the hedge and spoke. "You're trespassing." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It was hard and precise, loud enough to cut through the storm. The figures froze. The one with the cutter jerked back slightly. The one with the case didn't move at all. "I'm authorized to be here," she continued. "You're not. This is being recorded, and if you move 1 more inch, you're going to trigger a site-wide alert." It was a lie, but a well-crafted one. The man with the cutter stepped back fully now. His companion hesitated. Then, from behind them, a 4th figure appeared. Larger than the others, wrapped in a tan raincoat wide through the shoulders and unmistakably familiar in stance. Karen. She didn't yell. She didn't approach. She just looked at Layla, rain sliding down her cheeks, her eyes narrowed into furious slits. "This ends tonight," she said, loud enough to be heard but low enough to feel like a ritual. "You're not special. You don't belong here. You've built something that doesn't match the rest of us." Layla stood still. She didn't move, didn't answer. She let Karen's words blow past her like the rain. "I gave you chances," Karen added, stepping forward now, slowly. "But you kept pushing, kept ignoring the lines. This land isn't yours. You may have paper, but that doesn't make it real." "You're trespassing," Layla repeated, "and I'm done warning you." Karen didn't stop. She kept walking. 1 step, then another, and then she made a mistake. She reached forward. Whether out of instinct or anger or sheer arrogance, Karen reached through the gap in the fence, her hand lashing out like it had months before, trying to grab Layla by the shoulder again. But this time, the angle was different. The ground was slick, and Layla didn't move back. She shifted her weight and caught Karen's wrist midair, gripping it tight, using Karen's own forward motion to redirect her balance downward, just as she had that first day. But harder. Deliberate. Controlled. Karen fell forward into the lower rail of the fence, the edge with the subtle anti-animal bracing still in place. There was no scream, just a grunt of pain and a wet thud as her knees hit the mud and her shoulder slammed into the spike rail. She didn't fall through, but she hung awkwardly, caught between the bars, rain matting her hair to her face, one hand grasping the ground, the other twisted behind her back. None of the men moved to help her. "I'm not touching you," Layla said calmly. "You climbed in." "You get out," Karen hissed, something unintelligible and spiteful, then twisted hard, pulling herself out with a furious, undignified lurch that left a trail of blood down the front of her sleeve. She stood shaking, her face blotched with water and rage. "This isn't over," she snarled. "Yes," Layla said, voice like stone. "It is." The others backed away first. Then Karen followed, her coat torn, her hand cradled close to her chest. They disappeared into the trees, swallowed by wind and rain and the night's sudden hush. Layla stood still, soaked to the bone, heart pounding. She didn't chase. She didn't look back. When she finally returned to the cottage, she locked the door behind her and sat in silence, letting the storm finish its work outside. The motion sensor buzzed once more around midnight, brief, isolated. But she didn't rise. She knew they wouldn't return. Not that night. Not after this. Because some lines, once crossed, don't just redraw territory. They reset everything. And what Karen had tried to do, what she had failed to do, was take something that wasn't hers and break someone she couldn't intimidate. Now she had to live with the result. And Layla, finally, could begin to live with hers. The aftermath was not dramatic. There were no police visits, no lawsuits filed in the immediate wake, no flurry of neighborhood gossip carried by morning joggers or afternoon dog walkers. Instead, what followed was a deep and deliberate quiet, different from the brittle stillness that had shadowed Layla for so many weeks. This silence was complete, not in a threatening way, but in the way a theater feels after the curtain has fallen and the actors have left the stage. Something had ended, even if no one said it aloud. Karen didn't return. Not the next day, not the next week. The lights in her house still flickered on at dusk, still clicked off late at night, but she wasn't seen walking her dog, wasn't seen near the fence, and didn't appear at her windows the way she once had, watching from behind parted curtains like a sentinel convinced she was the last line of defense against some imagined corruption. Rumors circulated naturally. One neighbor mentioned something about a wrist brace. Another said Karen had canceled her weekly book club, muttering about needing rest. But no one asked Layla for her version. No one brought her into the circle. And for once, she didn't mind. She didn't need vindication. She already had something more valuable. Quiet work, uninterrupted days, full control over her timeline. The garden, which had once felt like a battlefield disguised as a project site, slowly became what it was always meant to be. A space for growth, for balance, for the careful placement of beauty among the raw and the tangled. The final stones were laid on the eastern basin under a sharp, clean morning sun. The soft-hued gravel path was re-leveled. The invasive ivy was trimmed back to the perimeter without resistance. Every plant rooted now held more meaning than before, not because they survived, but because Layla had. Her crew returned gradually. Ren didn't come back. He never called. But two of her past collaborators reached out after hearing whispers that the project was moving again. They arrived without fanfare and got to work, both understanding intuitively that Layla didn't need apologies or questions. She needed focus, hands in the dirt, structure laid where chaos once tried to take hold. And they gave her exactly that. In late autumn, the foundation scheduled a private showing. Not open to the public, not advertised. Just a small collection of conservationists, architects, and sponsors who had supported the initiative in quiet ways from the beginning. The invitation list was short. Layla approved each name personally. No local press, no neighborhood officials, and certainly no unsolicited guests. The evening came dressed in gold light and the scent of cooling soil. The guests moved slowly through the finished pathways, hands in pockets, conversation kept low, respectful. No one asked about the incidents. No one mentioned the disruptions. They saw the garden as it was, not as what it had survived, and that, for Layla, was enough. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long amber shadows over the gravel and stone, she stood near the entry archway, watching the final few guests depart. One of them, a woman from a preservation board in Vermont, paused to look at the small metal plaque affixed to the edge of the original fence. It was subtle, etched in aged brass, barely the size of a paperback. The engraving read, "Respect begins at the boundary." The woman turned, smiled, and nodded once, not in approval, but in understanding. When the garden was empty, Layla took one last walk, hands tucked into her jacket pockets, boots crunching softly against the stone. She passed the northeast corner, where the fence had once been Karen's battleground, and paused briefly near the rail where the last encounter had happened. There was no trace of it now. No blood, no scratches, no signs of intrusion. Just a soft cluster of ferns she had planted 3 days earlier, their fronds unfolding slowly under the filtered light. She didn't need to erase what had happened. She didn't need to mark it either. It was there, like a root system underground. Real, silent, unseen, but necessary. The weight of it lived in her spine, her decisions. The way she glanced now a little longer at the corners, but also in the way she stood. Steady, unmoved. Karen remained in her house. The windows stayed closed. Her voice was not heard again. Over time, new neighbors shifted in, and old ones learned to keep to their fences. Layla didn't push. She wasn't interested in reclaiming goodwill or rewriting the story for anyone. She had come here to build something, and she had, despite it all, and the land, for its part, held her work. Not as decoration, but as memory. Not as conquest, but as proof that persistence, when measured in quiet, is stronger than invasion. The garden wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and Layla, at last, could breathe in the middle of it without looking over her shoulder. There was nothing left to defend. There was only what remained, and it was hers.